Neanderthals' final hours. The extinction event. They erased from history. The spear tip shatters against frozen limestone, and the sound is wrong. Too brittle. The cold has done it again. 40,000 years before anyone thought to write anything down. A man whose name we will never know stares at the broken flint in his palm and feels what you and I would feel. The specific, sour dread of a tool failing at the worst possible moment. That man was not a brute. He was not a shuffling, a slack-jawed prop in somebody else's origin story. He was a Neanderthal, and the story of how he and his kind vanished from this planet is not the clean, triumphant narrative that gets printed in textbooks and sold on museum placards. It is messier than that, more political than that. And I have spent 31 years in excavation trenches from the Iberian Peninsula to the Altai Mountains, trying to scrape the actual truth out of the sediment. Here is what I know. The extinction of Homo neanderthalensis was not a single event. It was not a massacre, not a plague, not the predictable crowning of a superior species. What happened to Neanderthals was a slow, grinding attrition, a centuries-long erosion of margin. And the forces behind it were more complicated, more human, and frankly more uncomfortable than the field has been willing to admit. Let me take you back. Not to a cinematic savanna, but to the real thing. The Iberian coast, roughly 42,000 years ago. The wind comes off the Atlantic in sheets. It does not chill you. It penetrates. It finds the seam between your hide wrapping and your neck, and it pours cold into the muscle like water into a crack. A group of maybe 9 individuals shelters in a limestone overhang above what is now the Mousterian layer site of Gorham's Cave, Gibraltar. The fossils don't tell us everything, but my gut says this group is not a random band. There is structure here, and there is a woman, probably in her late 20s by her molar wear, who has a healed compression fracture in her left forearm. She took a blow, or a fall, and someone set that bone. Someone kept her alive through the weeks when she could not hunt. That is not animal behavior. That is a social contract. There is also an older male, perhaps 50, which among Neanderthals is genuinely old. His right femur healed from a break so severe that the callus formation is visible to the naked eye on the fossil cast I have handled at the Gibraltar Museum. This man should be dead 3 times over. The break itself, the infection risk in a Pleistocene environment, the inability to contribute to the hunt during recovery. He survived all of it, which means the group chose to keep him alive for years. You do not do that for a creature with no social value. You do not do that unless memory matters, unless knowledge matters, unless there is something in that old skull worth protecting. Standard archaeology will tell you Neanderthals lacked the symbolic cognition of modern humans. The evidence increasingly refuses to cooperate with that claim. At Cueva de los Aviones in Spain, perforated marine shells with residues of ochre and hematite have been dated to over 115,000 years ago. Let that number sit with you. That is 60,000 years before Homo sapiens even arrived in Europe. Neanderthals were collecting, perforating, and coloring shells for reasons that have nothing to do with calories or survival. If you want to call that something other than symbolic behavior, you need to explain what you are calling it instead. But let me get back to the dying, because that is what we came here to talk about. The conventional story runs like this. Homo sapiens migrates into Europe from Africa and the Levant beginning around 45,000 years ago. They bring superior tools, superior cognition, superior social networks, and they simply outcompete Neanderthals into oblivion within a few thousand years. Clean, logical, flattering to our own lineage. I do not buy it. Not entirely. The Schoningen spears, recovered from a lignite mine in Lower Saxony, are 295,000 years old. 8 throwing spears, crafted from spruce and pine, aerodynamically balanced the way a javelin is balanced, with the heaviest mass toward the front tip. Neanderthal craftsmanship.
Yes, this is the one.
The level of woodworking
Strong grain
skill
and no
required to
weakness.
produce these is not trivial. You have to select the right tree, the right section of trunk, understand the grain, scrape and shape over hours while maintaining a mental blueprint of a finished object that does not yet exist. Cognitive scientists call that hierarchical planning, and they used to say Neanderthals could not do it. Then we found the spears. The Levallois technique is older still, and if you have never tried to replicate it, you have no right to call it simple. You take a flint nodule and you prepare the core, removing flakes in a deliberate radial pattern to create a domed surface, a tortoise-shell geometry, and then, with one precise, calibrated strike, you detach a pre-formed flake of exactly the size and shape you intended from the beginning. And I have watched professional flint knappers with 15 years of experience fail this technique repeatedly. Neanderthals produced Levallois points the way a master carpenter cuts a dovetail joint. Muscle memory married to spatial intelligence. None of this stopped the dying. Here is where I start to veer from the comfortable narrative, and I want you to follow me carefully, because this is the part that gets buried. Climate is the underwritten killer in every Neanderthal discussion, and it still gets insufficient attention. Between 45,000 and 40,000 years ago, Western Europe experienced what paleoclimatologists call Heinrich Event 4, a catastrophic cooling episode triggered by a pulse of fresh water into the North Atlantic from melting ice sheets. The Gulf Stream essentially stalled. Temperatures in Western Europe dropped precipitously.
Where am I?
The forests that Neanderthals had spent hundreds of thousands of years learning to hunt, to navigate, to read, largely disappeared. The megafauna they depended on either migrated or collapsed in population. In the space of perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 years, the ecological knowledge base of an entire human lineage became partially obsolete. Imagine that, your entire pharmacopoeia of plant knowledge, your mental map of migration corridors, your understanding of where the reindeer cross the river in November, all of it being slowly undermined by a world that is changing faster than cultural transmission can adapt to. And into this destabilized landscape walks Homo sapiens, with bigger social networks, with the ability to trade across distances of hundreds of kilometers, which we know from the dispersal of marine shell ornaments through sapiens sites far inland. with a demographic baseline that was simply larger, probably because our species had been expanding out of Africa for tens of thousands of years through varied environments, and had a kind of ecological generalism that Neanderthals, highly specialized for European conditions, could not match in a crisis. This is not a story about inferior minds. This is a story about catastrophic bad luck, compounded by demographic mathematics. But I want to linger on the contact period, because this is where things get genuinely strange and the textbooks get genuinely evasive. At sites like Grotte du Renne in Arcy-sur-Cour in France, Neanderthal produced what archaeologists call the Châtelperronian industry, a blade-based technology with personal ornaments including perforated animal teeth and ivory rings that looks, to a casual eye, like the Aurignacian material being produced by incoming sapiens groups at the same time. See, the argument over whether Neanderthals invented this independently or copied it from sapiens' neighbors has run for decades, and it remains unsettled. My position, and I acknowledge this is not consensus, is that the directionality of influence does not actually matter as much as the fact of the interaction. These groups were watching each other, trading with each other, very probably sleeping with each other. We know the last part because the DNA tells us. And the admixture events between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens that produced the residual 1 to 4% Neanderthal ancestry in every non-African human alive today did not happen in a single encounter. The genomic evidence points to multiple admixture events across different geographic regions and time periods. These were not isolated accidents. This was sustained, repeated, probably multi-generational contact, which means that the final Neanderthal communities and the last holdouts in the Iberian refugia were not isolated primitives dying in ignorance. They were the remnant of a long interaction. They had seen our kind. They had traded with us, possibly fought with us, certainly bred with us. And still they were reduced to a few coastal pockets, subsisting on marine resources, making art we only partly understand, and then simply going quiet in the archaeological record. The last confirmed Neanderthal site, as of the current evidence, is probably in southern Spain, around 37 to 40,000 years ago. The fossils don't give us a dramatic final scene. There is no last stand. There is just a gradual thinning of the signal, a tapering of the lithic assemblage, and then nothing. The silence of sediment. I find this more haunting than any cinematic ending, because it means the actual death of the last Neanderthal was probably mundane. Thus, a child too sick to recover from an infection that would have been survivable a century earlier when the group was larger. An elder whose accumulated knowledge died with him because there were not enough young people left to pass it to. A pregnant woman whose labor went wrong in a cave too small and too cold and too far from anyone else who might have helped. The infection in a molar I mentioned earlier is not a metaphor. At La Chapelle-aux-Saints, the famous old man specimen that gave us the original stooped posture brute stereotype showed severe dental disease, arthritis so advanced in his joints that walking must have been agonizing and bone loss consistent with systemic infection.
Not yet, I will be
This
here.
man was probably in constant pain. And he was alive, cared for, kept fed in that condition for years. The people who did that for him were not brutes. The stooped posture, incidentally, was a misreconstruction by Marcelin Boule in 1911, based on pathological specimens and filtered through assumptions that the field is still decontaminating itself from more than a century later. Boule saw what his era expected him to see. Subsequent researchers had to fight institutional inertia for decades to correct the record. Science is supposed to be self-correcting. It is, but slowly. And the cultural damage from that original brute image calcified in popular imagination long before the corrections arrived. I want to make one final argument before I give you the ending this story deserves. The tools from Abri Peroni in the Dordogne, specifically the lissoirs, the bone-smoothing tools used to work hides, represent a technology that had no equivalent in the contemporaneous sapiens toolkit in that region. Neanderthals were making better leather-working tools than we were.
The stitching
Let
holds
that
tight.
register. The species we have spent a century patronizing was, in at least one documented technical domain, ahead of us. The genetic ghost is the hardest part to sit with. When I read a genomic study confirming that sequences of Neanderthal DNA in modern humans include variants associated with immune response, with adaptation to high latitudes, with keratin expression that affects skin and hair, I feel something I cannot fully articulate. These are not trivial leftovers. They are functional. They work. And the Neanderthal contribution to our immune systems almost certainly helped early Homo sapiens populations survive the European pathogens that Neanderthals had been co-evolving with for hundreds of thousands of years. We absorbed them. We carry them. Every person reading this who has European or Asian ancestry is, in the most literal biological sense, part Neanderthal. The extinction was not total. It was a merger, partial and violent and lopsided, but a merger nonetheless. 40,000 years ago, the last of them slipped out of the record without ceremony, without monument, without anyone to mark the moment. No one lit a fire in their memory. The ochre-stained shells sat in the sediment and waited for us to find them. We found them. We dated them. We ran the isotopes and sequenced the genomes and argued in journals about what it all means. What it means is this: they were here for 300,000 years. They buried their dead, and they cared for the injured. They made tools of extraordinary precision. They painted caves and strung beads and survived ice ages that would obliterate most of what we consider civilization today. They looked at the night sky over Ice Age Europe, and whatever they felt when they looked at it, we have no way to know. That absence is the true extinction, not the bones. The interiority, the pulse of their genome still moves through us. 2% in your immune cells, in the keratin of your skin, in adaptations to cold that you will never consciously need, but that your body carries anyway, like muscle memory for a climate that no longer exists. They are not entirely gone. They are just very, very quiet. And given what we did to them, maybe that is the only dignity we had left to give.